Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be building a pie chart that looks pretty similar to this one here from the Nivo or Nivo library. And the point of this video though isn't so much how to build this pie chart, which I guess we'll learn in the process, but the point is that this pie chart library wants the data in a certain format, and the data we have is not in that format yet. So we are going to be looking at some practice using reduce, map, filter, and some of the different array functions like that so that we can transform our data into the correct format that we want. So if we start looking at this library, click this tab here. Here we can see how to use the component. I've already set this up in our code, so no need to really focus on that too much. But what's important is how this component wants to receive its data. So if we come over here, what it wants is an array of objects where each object has an ID, a label, sort of what gets displayed here on the right. It has a value, so how big of a pie piece it should take up, and then what color it should be. So we need at the end to have our data look like this. So let's take a look at what our data looks like currently and then how we're going to get it there. So I've got some data here in a file, very nicely named data. So what is this data? This is the output from the GitHub GraphQL API of my last 50 repositories. So sort of some of the information about the repository itself, such as its name, description, and then each of the languages that were used in this repository. So here we have one that just uses Ruby. Come down here, there's one that's Ruby, JavaScript, CoffeeScript, CSS, HTML. So each repository can have one or more languages. So here's a couple, Groovy and Java. This one has 4 or 5 here. Okay, so just to quickly show you where that came from. As I mentioned, it came from the GitHub GraphQL API. So over here, I've got a GraphQL query, and then what it produces over here on the right. And I'm actually not going to go into GraphQL at this point because that is the video after this one that I'm going to be doing. So stay tuned, subscribe if you're interested. But right now, we're just working with the data that it produces. So if you'd like to follow along, down in the links below, there'll be a link to my website, which will have branches for the starting point and the end point. If you want to dive in and code along with me, that's fine. Or you can just look at the finished example. So let's just look at this data a little bit closer. So it's an object that has a data property, which basically contains all the data returned by GraphQL. It's got a viewer property. In GitHub GraphQL, viewer represents the current user asking for the data. So the viewer in this case would be me because it's my data. And then I've got repositories. Now you may think this is where sort of the array of repositories starts, but the way GitHub structured their data, it actually isn't. Repositories has something called nodes, and nodes is the actual array. So that is where we get sort of the array of, we could call them repository nodes. So now each repository node has a name, description, URL. We're not really interested in this at this point. What it has is a languages property, which again has the same nodes format like repositories did, where nodes is an array of languages. So each language has a corresponding color and then its name or label. So let's look at how we can transform this data, where if we just looked at, say, the first 2 repositories here, we've got 2 Rubies, a JavaScript, and then one of each of these ones down here. So it's obviously in the wrong format, and we need to convert it into the format that this library is looking for, where we, in this case, would have Ruby, Ruby 2, and then its color, so whatever this color is here. So let's start converting that. Just to look at how the code looks, it's a Create React app that renders an app component. The app component imports this data. As I mentioned, eventually there'll be a video on how to pull this from GraphQL in your React app, but for now I've just hard-coded it in here. So when this app component, it starts out with no repositories, and just right away, I throw the data.viewer.repositories. So this is the property that contains an array of nodes, or a nodes property, which is an array of them. So I just throw that in the state right away. So this is obviously overkill for this example, but that's because I've sort of got this app halfway through that will eventually be GraphQL. So if we come down here in the render, we've got a little bit of styling, just a div with some sizing and font properties. We've got an H2 that says we're talking about the top languages that I use in my repositories. And then as long as this data is set in the state, we're going to render a component called top languages and pass it the repository's data, which comes from our state. So if we go into this component, top languages, it's just a simple functional component that takes the repositories as a prop and renders the responsive pie chart, which comes from that library Nivo. So I'm only using a few of the properties here, sort of setting its margins, its radius and angles and whatnot. That's just look and feel stuff. What we're interested in right now is the data. So as I mentioned, the data right now is not in the correct format. So what I've done is I've got a little function here called top languages, where you can pass it in the repositories, and basically it's going to go through this transformation of the data into the array of objects in the correct format. So this lives up in this little services data massagers file that I've created. So let's go here. So I've got one function that I'm exporting called top languages, which receives the repositories and right now just returns an empty array. So this is where we got to do our actual work. But just to make it easier to write, I sort of put an example of what the final data we're looking for should look like. As you're building this function, you should have an idea of what the final data should look like before you start building the function. Otherwise, you don't really know what you're building, right? So it should look like this. An array of objects that have a color, ID, JavaScript, label JavaScript, and then whatever value. So what I've done is I've created a test for this function. So we're going to be doing a bit of TDD as we build this function out. So if you go in your __ test folder above, there's a file with the same name, and it imports the function we're going to be testing. And it also imports data from sample data. So if data was like all of my repositories, there's quite a few of them. I think it pulled like the last 50. We don't want all of these because that's a lot of data to test with. We just want a sample so that it's easier for us to sort of know what the final result should look like. So here I got one called sample data, which is the same format, but it's just 3 repository nodes. So I've got the languages used in the blog, my website. Another enumerables presentation I did at a talk at a meetup once, and then this repository hotel that I forked that has a few different languages. So I've already gone through it, and I've already sort of determined that the final data should look like this. It should be an array with 3 JavaScripts, 3 CSS, 3 HTML, and 2 Ruby. And what you've noticed is I've sort of just not included any language that's only been used once. Because in the end, this is going to produce a pie chart. So if it's filled up with like a ton of languages I hardly ever used, I didn't really want that. I suppose I could put them all into an other category, but I didn't decide to. So if we look at this test, it produces the array of top languages for use in my pie chart. And what I do is I call my function, passing it the sample data, and then I get a result back, which I just call langs. So I'm expecting that langs will eventually be equal to this data here. So if I go down into my terminal below and I run yarn, font's a little bit small, hopefully you can see that. So if I run the tests, the green is what I'm expecting. In that, this above, the red is what I'm currently getting. So that empty array, which makes sense because that's what I'm returning, an empty array. So let's get started. So anytime I'm doing counts, because that's essentially what I'm doing right now, I want to find out how many times does the JavaScript language appear in all my repositories. And remember, each repository has multiple languages, so I want to find the counts of each time a language was used. The best way, sort of the way I like to do it, maybe it's not the best way, but it's to essentially build up an object. So I'll just give an example above, where you've got, say, the language itself, and then its value could just be like a count, like 4 or whatever. But if I wanted to record additional information, I could have like its count as 4 and its color as whatever. Let's just say white. So you'd have this, and then we'll just say this one is black. So Ruby would be 3. So I want to build up an object that looks like this. And this is obviously not the final format I want to get to, but it's starting to get closer because now I know the counts of each language and I know its color. I also know its label and its ID here. So in this object format like this, I have all the information I need to eventually get it looking like this. So if we come back here and look at our data, so first things first, I've got I'm already at this level here. So I have to access its nodes and essentially go through each node. And then for each node, or for each repository node, go through each language node. So there's 2 loops or 2 arrays I need to go through. So there's going to be 2 sort of looping constructs. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to use a for each. I'm going to use something called reduce. And it's a little bit hard to wrap your mind around, I think, at the beginning, but once you get it, it's a really nice function to use. So what does reduce do? Let's start writing it, and then maybe we'll talk about what it's used for. So the goal of reduce is essentially to take an array of something and produce a different object or number or array. So it's basically to reduce all your elements of array from that to something else. So just as an example, we could use it to count. So I'm going to go into, we'll go into Chrome here and we'll just go into the inspect tools. Go into the console here. All right. So say I have an array of numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Say I wanted to find out how many there are. So you could just ask for length, right? Gives you 4. But what if it didn't have this length property and you had to figure it out on your own? So you could write a variable, let count equals 0, and then you could go through all the numbers with for each. So for each number, do something. Shoot. Okay. It's hard to write in this console. And then for each number, I actually don't really care about the number. All I want to do is say count plus plus. So now if I go back to count, I've got 4. Sort of I loop through each number. I don't care what the number is. All I want to do is for every one of them, I want to add 1 to that variable that I created here. This doesn't really have like a functional feel. It feels more sort of like not the modern PHP, but the PHP I used to write back in the day, where you sort of define a variable and you loop and you modify that variable above. So a nice way to do this in JavaScript and more functional style programming is to use a reduce. And in this case, we want to reduce this array of numbers into a single number that just tells us how many there are. So what you do is similar to for each, except we're going to say reduce. So just like for each, you pass an arrow function as your first argument. And make this bigger. And what this arrow function receives isn't just the element that we're looping over, but it is the sort of final value that we want to keep track of. So in this case, it's our count. So we'll say count, and I may have the order wrong, so I'll find that out very quickly. But count and number. I should probably just figure this out. JavaScript reduce. Okay, yep, so the count and then your number. Perfect. So it receives two things. The count at whatever value it's currently at, and then the number as we're looping through the numbers. So your goal in this arrow function is to take the old state, so whatever count was at, so let's say it was at 0, and your goal is to return the new state. And you can calculate whatever the new state should be based on this number here. So in this case, again, I don't care what this number has. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to return my old state, but the new version of my old state. So +1. Now with reduce, you also need to tell it, okay, your very first loop, what should count be? It's going to be 0 at the beginning. So there we go. We took our numbers and we reduced them. And we sort of looped through each one. And each time we sort of built up this counter. We always received what was its previous value. And then we returned whatever the new value is. Or old state, old value, new value. So we returned that. You could easily change this to be the sum. So just change that to sum. So instead of +1, you could have it be the sum plus the number. So now it's 10. 1 + 2 + 3 + 4 is 10. So it's very flexible, but you don't just have to reduce it to a number. You can reduce it to an object, to an array, to any other data type that you would like. So let's go back here. We've got our test, which says it's currently failing. We'll just close that for now. So we want to take our repositories, and remember that it has nodes, which is the actual array, and we want to reduce those. So it receives an arrow function and its initial value. So before I even fill in this function, remember that we want to produce something that looks like this. So what should its initial value be? Imagine there were no repositories to loop over. It would be an empty object. Okay? So now we need to fill in here. So we always sort of have our accumulator, or the value that our old state gets passed in here. And what should we call this? We can just call this the lengs. And then we have our current item that we're iterating over from our nodes. So we could just call this a repository. Okay. So at the end, the final thing the reduce gives you back is sort of your final reduced value. So we'll just call this the lang object, because it's an object with langs inside of it, with the count for each one and its color. So here's where it gets a little bit tricky here. Unfortunately, we're diving into the deep end, and it's going to be a reduce in a reduce. So why is that? It's because that we've got an array of repository nodes, but each repository has multiple languages. So now we need to go and reduce those languages for the current repository that we're on. So we'll just use an intermediate variable. So we'll call this the repo lang object. Crappy name, but that's fine. And what we're going to do is take our repository, which has languages, and remember that it's in an array of nodes, and we want to reduce that. So arrow function and its initial value goes here. So here, we don't want to start out at an empty object like we did at the very beginning. What we want to start this reduce out at is however our current language object is like. So say it's at JavaScript with 2 or whatever, we want to start it out as this object here. This object here is stored in our langs variable. So we do that here, and we need to give it, remember, old state, new state, so we can call it repo langs here. And then what are we looping over? We're looping over each language for this repository. Okay. So let's just start consoling out sort of what we've got so we can see it. So if I console.log language, what does it look like? Oh, it's not liking this thing here. Cool. So here you can see that we're looping over each language. Sorry, it's a little hard to see. So each language is the color and the name of Ruby, color, JavaScript, like so. And we want to start building up this object in this format. So if it already existed, we could just access it based on its language name and increment the count by 1. But the problem is, what if we haven't encountered JavaScript yet? So we have to handle that case. So what we'll do is we'll say, if we've already seen this, if we haven't seen this language before, so if it doesn't exist in the object that we're building up, we'll give it an initial value. So we'll access it here, and we'll say that its value will start out at count 0, and color can be the language.color. Like that. Okay, so now we've initialized, let's just say, what's the first one here? Ruby. We've initialized, so we've Ruby here is at 0 and whatever Ruby's color is. So now below this if statement, we can assume that we have Ruby in there. So now we can access it and increment its count. So .count ++. Okay. So what we've done here is we'd now be at Ruby 1 and with Ruby's color. And with reduce, you always take the old state, so that's the repo langs. We've modified it, and now we have to return the new version of it. So here's the new state we're returning. Now, remember that we're a reduce in a reduce. So to deal with that, we put this reduces response in a variable. So essentially, we came in with langs, we passed that as the initial value for our inner reduce, and our inner reduce gave us something back called the repo lang object. So let's just console.log this so we can see what's inside of it. So I'll save that. Oh boy. Cannot read property JavaScript of undefined. Cannot read property JavaScript. All right, what line is this happening at? 25. So I don't know what's happening, so I need to Let's console.log our repo langs and our language. So what's it doing for each one? Okay, I think I know what the issue is. So you always have to return the new state, but what we didn't do is return the new state for our outer reduce. So this repo lang response, which our reduce gave us back, is what needs to be returned as the new state for our outer reduce. So if we look here, there's at least no errors. And if I return lang object, which is obviously wrong at this point, but we're making progress. So what we've got is we expected an array in the format that our pie chart wants, but what we currently have is an object where it's got a key being the language, and then its color plus its count. So you see here we got CSS at 3, CoffeeScript at 1, HTML at 3, JavaScript at 3, etc. So we're making progress. So I'm just going to copy this here. So this is sort of what we're currently dealing with. So I'll paste that. This is what we've got. So we need to convert this object into this array here, where we've got an array in this format. Okay, so how do you convert an object into an array? There's a couple ways to do it. In newer versions of JavaScript, there is something called object.entries. And what it gives you back is an array where each array element is another array that has the key. So it would be CSS in this one, and its value is like this here. So CSS and its value. Next one would be CoffeeScript and its value, like that. So we'll do that first, and then we'll look at how we can create our own object.entries version. Okay. So if we do object.entries, we want the entries of our lang object. And we'll just put it in a variable. So we'll call it, if that's the lang object, this is the lang array, we'll say. And then we'll just console.log so we can see. Oh, object.entries does not exist. Okay, so this is actually a good point. Depending on what version of Node you're running, so I guess this terminal is not using the right one. Say I came down here and just cleared that out and I did yarn test. Again, it doesn't work, so let me just check my Node version. So that's why. So if I just tell it to use the one that I had in my .nvmrc and now ran yarn test, it would at least work. And what we've got being output is an array where each array is its key and as the first element or 0, and then its value as the second element in this array. So this array is at least in an array at this point, not an object, but it's not in the right format. So what we need to do is convert an array that has each element in one format into an array that has each element in a modified version of that. So what you want to do let me just see if this one works now. No. So this terminal is still old. Maybe I can just say nvm use yarn test. Cool. So this one's now working with entries at least. So the function we want to use when we're converting an array where each element in the array gets converted into a new element in a different array is map. And just to show you another lame example, let's say we again have an array of numbers and we want a new array of numbers where each number is doubled. So it should be 2, 4, 6, and 8. So we use map, and map receives an arrow function just like for each, where what it receives is the element, and in this case, unlike for each, where for each you can't return anything in the function here, map expects you to return something. And what it expects you to return is the new value. So if the old value is 1, we want the new value to be num times 2. So it's going to go through each element, perform this operation on it, and produce a new array at the end that has 2, 4, 6, and 8. So if I run this, here's our final result. So what we've done is we've mapped each element in this array to a new array. Same number of elements, just each element has been modified in some way. Oh boy. All right, we got to get going now. So we're going to map this, and we've got so map receives an arrow function, and I'm just going to expand it like this. And because entries receives an array that is the first element is the key, second value is the value, what we can do is just use destructuring here to say key and value like this, so that we have it in their own variables like so. So what we want to do is produce a new object that has this format where we've got the color, the ID, the label, and the value. Okay, so we'll start with ID. ID is the key. Label is also the key, which the key in this case is like JavaScript or Ruby or whatever language. Now it's got a value. So it's not this value here, because value represents this entire object here. So it would be value.count is what we need to map it to. And then last thing is we need the color, so that would be the value.color. Cool. So if we run this, and this time we return our lang array instead, what you'll see is that it's mostly in the right format now. It's actually just in the incorrect order. And it has CoffeeScript, which only has 1. And I didn't want any languages or TypeScript that only showed up 1 time. So what I'm going to do is take our lang array, and we'll just do it right here in line. And what we're going to do is we're going to remove some elements. Or in better terms, we're going to filter it and select the elements that we want. So instead of rejecting the ones we don't want, we select the ones we do want. So here we can say that we take our lang array and we're going to filter it. And filter receives an arrow function where your value that it receives is the language as you're looping over it. And then we need to return something truthy if we want to keep this language, or falsy if we want to discard it. So let's say here we only want languages that have a value that's greater than 1. And in the real data, there's a few languages that don't have a color. So we'll just say, and we want it to have a color. So take all of our languages, filter them, and we want to keep each language if its value is over 1 and it has a color. So if I save this, we should be getting closer now. We no longer have CoffeeScript and TypeScript there, but they're in the wrong order. So let's just keep chaining our function calls. This produced an array, filter produces an array. So now we want to sort them. which also produces an array. So each time we're sort of just producing a new version of our languages array. So sort is a function which you can't just call sort on it, because remember that the thing we're sorting is this object here. So you can't sort an object like that. What you really want to sort is the value of that object. So what sort does is you're required to give it an arrow function, and it's going to give you two different languages, and then it's up to you of how you compare them. One sort of easy way to do that, I'd always just call them A and B, A language or B language. And the simplest way to do this is if I want it in descending order. So descending would be the biggest number at the top, so JavaScript or whatever the most popular language is, going down to the least popular. I can just return the b.value minus the a.value. So essentially what you're doing is you're returning like a new number, and then sort's going to use that as how it can compare each language. So if I run that, now my tests are all passing because I've taken them and I've put them in the correct order. So let's say that I did the opposite. Now they're in the exact opposite order that they should be. So if you want ascending order, you would do it this way. If you want descending order, you do it that way. Okay. So in the real one, in the sample data, I only have a few languages, so it's not a big deal. But let's say that we don't want 50 languages in our pie chart, we want 5. What we can do is take this array that we got back after sorting the elements, and we can just pick the first 5 of them. So the way you do that is with slice. And you give it 2 indexes, so where you want to start and where you want to end. So we're going to start at index 0 and end before index 5. So that would give you elements 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which happens to be the first 5 elements of our array. So if I run that, test still passes because I didn't have 5 languages anyway, but now it should be doing things correctly. So now that our code should be working, let's actually run this thing and see. So if I just tell it to yarn start, we'll pop open this. Hopefully we won't have any errors. Sweet. All right, so here are my top languages. Apparently I use JavaScript the most, followed by CSS, HTML, Ruby, and Elixir. And if we come in here and inspect our React, what you can see is that passed into this, there's no, it says unknown here, but that's the top languages functional component. So we can see that we passed in here our array of repository nodes, and each node had an array of a language nodes array with our languages. So we took that thing obviously in the wrong format, but after transforming it, we passed it to our responsive pie as data, where we had an array of languages, in this case, which are in the correct format for this pie chart. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Essentially what we covered here, we did a bit of TDD work to transform data from one format into the format that you need for the pie chart. This is really common in sort of any visual display of your data, where you've got it in one way, but you need it in this other way over here. So we did that by using reduce, which takes an array and you can reduce all the elements of the array to a new value. But essentially, as I showed, each time you do it, you're taking sort of the old state, which in this case starts out as an empty object, and it's your job to return the new state as you loop over each of the things that you're reducing. So you can use reduce to produce a count, produce a sum, produce an object like we did. Shoot, you could even re-implement the map function as a reduce. So it's probably the most flexible, but also the most complicated, unfortunately. So we did 2 reduces here. We had to reduce the repository nodes and then the language nodes inside. So you went from like this example here in the browser with numbers to the most complicated thing ever. But that's hopefully okay. So then we had an object, because that's what we reduced it to. And we had to convert that object into an array where each element of the array had the format that our pie chart was expecting. So to do that, we used map, which allows you to convert one array into an array with the same number of elements, but you've modified each element along the way. Then what we've done is we've filtered out languages in our array that we didn't want. So languages we'd only used once, or languages that don't have a color. And then we took our filtered set of languages and we've sorted them by the value. And then we just picked the first 5. So let's say I want the first 10, just so we can see what my data looks like. So here's my first 10 languages. And I don't even think there are 10 languages because they get down to the point where they're only used once. So let's say we don't care. As long as they have a color, we're good with that. Now you can see there's a bunch of ones. So a little bit of PHP, a little bit of Java, etc. And this is only my public repository. So if I included all my private work ones, it would probably look a little bit different. But that's what we've got. So I hope everyone enjoyed this video. Please subscribe, because coming up very soon, I will have a video on how to actually use GraphQL and React to pull this data to produce this pie chart, so that you can plug in your GitHub key, and then you can see which languages you use in a pie chart like this. And eventually we're going to build a full React app that allows you to filter your repositories by language and search them and view some stats on them and things like that. So that's where we're eventually going, but it will take a couple videos to get there. So anyways, hope you had a nice time watching this. Have a great day. Take care.